The evening air in Albuquerque carried a chill that reminded me of how quickly desert nights fall into shadow. I stepped into La Terraza, a restaurant where Robert and I had celebrated anniversaries, graduations, and once even Julian's 10th birthday. Tonight, it was meant to be my turn to mark 65 years with family. Not spectacle. Julian rose from the table by the window as I approached, his smile tight, his hands restless on the linen. Beside him, Kiara gleamed in a red dress. Her voice pitched a shade too high as she called out, "Happy birthday, Isolde." She kissed the air near my cheek before guiding me into the chair opposite her. A few friends and extended relatives were already seated, murmuring pleasantries. We ordered. The small talk flowed as it always did. Weather, work, Kiara's redecorating plans. For a moment, I let myself believe this dinner was simply a gathering, nothing more. But after the plates were cleared, Kiara set down her glass and folded her hands, her smile sharpening. "Isolde," she announced. "Julian and I decided this will be your last meal of freedom before the nursing home." Laughter flickered uncomfortably around the table. Unsure if this was a joke, my son kept his eyes on his napkin, his silence louder than her words. The sting was sharp, but not new. I reached for my wine, sipped slowly, and placed the glass back on the table with deliberate calm. "Then," I said, "steady and clear. This is your last meal while having a house to live in." Kiara's smile faltered, and Julian's fork clattered against his plate. I gathered my purse and rose, leaving their nervous laughter and the weight of my words hanging in the air as I walked out into the cooling night, already certain of my next call. When I reached home that night, I set my purse on the hall table and loosened the clasp of Robert's watch. The silver band had dulled with time, but I wore it for every important moment, as if his hand still steadied mine. Tonight, the weight felt heavier than usual, pressing not only against my wrist, but against years of memories that refused to stay quiet. 15 years had passed since Robert's sudden heart attack. Julian was just 25 then, floundering between jobs and ideas of who he wanted to be. I remember grading papers until dawn at the community college, then rushing home to pack his lunch as though he were still in high school. Bills stacked like bricks. But I paid them one by one, even when it meant skipping meals or postponing car repairs. The hardest years came during the housing crash of 2008. Julian called me in tears one night, saying the bank was about to take his home. I drove across town with a check I had no business writing, draining nearly every savings bond Robert and I had built. I told Julian it was temporary, that he'd pay me back when things got better. He never did, and I never asked. At the time, I believed that was what mothers did: shield, provide, erase the ledger before it turned into shame. I thought if I gave enough, Julian would learn gratitude, responsibility, maybe even tenderness. But over the years, as Kiara entered his life with her designer handbags and taste for constant renovations, I began to notice how easily Julian looked past my sacrifices. He no longer called just to hear my voice. He called when he needed something signed, loaned, or solved. I ran a hand across Robert's watch face, cold under my fingers, and realized that silence had become my biggest mistake. I had given everything without demanding respect in return, and tonight had shown me where that path had led. I turned toward the drawer where the deed lay hidden, already knowing it was time to stop pretending I had nothing left. I did not sleep that night. The silence in the house pressed in on me, broken only by the ticking of Robert's old clock in the hall. Just before midnight, I pulled open the bottom drawer of the desk where I kept papers no one else knew about. My hands brushed past utility bills and insurance statements until they touched the thick envelope, the one I had hidden away like a guilty secret. Inside lay the deed proof that the house Julian and Kiara lived in was mine, not theirs. I remembered the day I signed it. Julian's mortgage had collapsed in the wreckage of the housing crash. He and Kiara were drowning in debt, barely keeping the lights on. I paid the arrears without hesitation, insisting only that the deed be transferred into my name to protect the property from creditors. I thought it would be temporary, just a shield until they found their footing. But as the years passed, and gratitude never came, I left the papers tucked away, with the restaurant humiliation still echoing in my ears. I reached for the phone and dialed Eduardo Serrano. He had been Robert's friend long before he was my attorney, steady and discreet, the kind of man who never needed reminders of loyalty. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm but alert. "I'm sorry to call so late," I said, "but it can't wait. I need to review a deed." When he arrived the next morning, coffee in hand, I spread the papers across the kitchen table. Eduardo read them carefully, nodding as if he already knew where this would lead. "You hold the title," he said. "If they escalate their threats, you have every right to begin eviction proceedings." For the first time in years, I felt no fear, only clarity. I pressed the deed flat beneath my palm, steady as the desert sun, and knew I was finished living as if I had nothing to protect. The real battle, I sensed, was only beginning. By the end of the week, the phone began ringing in ways that carried more sting than comfort. My cousin in Phoenix called first, her voice tight with rehearsed sympathy. "Isolde, I heard you've been forgetting things. Maybe it's time you considered some help." Then a niece in El Paso left a message, "Tia, we're worried about you. Julian says you can't keep up anymore." Each call felt less like concern and more like planted seeds. Kiara's work was obvious. Her voice had traveled faster than the desert wind. And now my name carried whispers of decline. On Friday afternoon, the knock at my door came sharp and uninvited. When I opened it, a woman in a white coat stood there, clipboard in hand. "Senora Marlowe, I'm Dr. Vega, a geriatric specialist. Your family asked me to evaluate you." The audacity made me almost laugh. Without my consent, I asked, keeping my voice steady. "Sometimes families worry," she said, with that clinical softness that masks intrusion. "Then they can pursue it legally. You will not enter my home without a court order." I held the door firm, my gaze level. For a moment, she faltered. "I'll note your refusal," she said finally, and left with a polite smile that carried more pity than respect. As I closed the door, I saw Julian's car idling across the street. He stepped out, hands shoved deep in his pockets, eyes shifting. "Mom," he began, "Kiara just wants what's best. Maybe it wouldn't hurt to be checked." I felt a flare of heat in my chest. "Julian, I manage my finances. I read every morning. I drive safely. I run this house. What exactly am I supposed to be forgetting?" He swallowed, but his silence told me enough. He was uneasy, torn between truth and loyalty to her. That night, I called my primary doctor and scheduled a full evaluation, blood work, cognitive tests, every record I might need. If Kiara wanted to build a narrative, I would confront it with facts. The deed lay still on my table, its edges sharp under the lamplight, and I understood that the next strike would not come quietly. The following Monday, I sat at my desk pulling together papers for my upcoming evaluation. I wanted every medical document ready, neat and indisputable. As I shifted folders, I reached for the small wooden jewelry box Robert had given me on our 20th anniversary. Inside, I usually kept more than ornaments. I kept pieces of memory, reminders of a life that had meaning before all this. But when I lifted the lid, silence greeted me. The velvet lining lay bare where my mother's pearl necklace should have gleamed. The emerald earrings from my Aunt Celia were gone too. even the gold bracelet Robert gave me after Julian's birth was missing. For a long moment, I simply sat there, staring into the emptiness. My pulse pounded in my ears, the betrayal landing heavier than the box itself. I called Eduardo immediately. His voice steadied me. "Don't move anything." "Isolda, I'll send someone." By late afternoon, a private investigator named Mendoza sat in my kitchen, flipping through photographs of the missing pieces. He was efficient, blunt, and within 2 days, he had answers. "There's a pawn shop near Old Town that logged items matching your list," he reported. We pulled the records. They were sold 2 months ago. My stomach tightened. By whom he slid across grainy security stills. My son's face, unmistakable, stood beside Chiara. She looked radiant, her hands resting possessively on Julian's arm as he signed the papers. The pearls dangled in the shopkeeper's hand, cheapened under fluorescent light. I felt something inside me break, not from grief alone, but from clarity. This wasn't Chiara acting alone. Julian had been there, participating, handing over heirlooms meant for future generations, trinkets that once carried love and continuity. Eduardo studied me quietly. "We can present this as evidence. It strengthens everything." I traced a finger along the blurred image of Julian's profile. He had once leaned that same head against my shoulder when storms frightened him. Now he turned it away from me entirely. The weight of that shift left me cold, but not paralyzed. I closed the folder, slid it into Eduardo's briefcase, and said the words that surprised even me. "Prepare whatever comes next." By dawn the next morning, the sound of fists on my front door made it clear that Chiara was not finished. The pounding at my front door came just as the first streaks of pale orange touched the Sandia Mountains. I pulled my robe tighter and opened the door only a crack. Chiara stood there, hair wild, eyes blazing. "You think you can humiliate us?" she spat. "You think a piece of paper makes you queen of everything?" Her voice carried down the street, pulling neighbors from their blinds. I kept my hand steady on the doorframe. "Leave. Chiara, this isn't your property." "Not my property." She laughed, harsh and hollow. "Julian and I built that house. You're just a bitter old woman trying to steal it from us." I shut the door, locked it, and dialed the police. By the time Officer Rodriguez arrived, Eduardo was already on his way with a folder full of documents. Chiara's rage hadn't dimmed. She shouted in the driveway about betrayal and cruelty until her voice cracked. Rodriguez, a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes, listened patiently before knocking on my door. I handed him the deed, the pawn slips, and the bank statements Eduardo had prepared. "She and my son pawned jewelry that wasn't theirs," I said, "and the house they claim is theirs was signed over years ago. Every cent came from me." Eduardo arrived moments later, calm and precise, reinforcing every word with dates, signatures, notarized seals. Rodriguez flipped through the stack, then turned toward Chiara. His tone shifted from polite to commanding. "Ma'am, you have no legal standing here. You need to leave this property immediately." Her face drained, anger collapsing into shock. She glanced at Julian, who had been hovering at the edge of the yard, shoulders slumped, eyes refusing to meet mine. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and stared at the gravel as if answers might appear there. "Julian," I said softly, but he didn't move. Chiara's final words were a hiss. "You'll regret this." She pulled him toward the car, her nails dug into his arm. He didn't resist. When the patrol car followed them out of sight, Eduardo turned to me. "It's time, Isolda. File the charges." I nodded, my voice steady. "Yes. Eviction and theft." By the time the sun cleared the horizon, I had signed the papers that would change everything. 2 days after filing the charges, I received the call from Detective Silva. Julian had been taken into custody at the downtown bank where he worked. The words settled over me like dust, expected and heavy all at once. By the following afternoon, I stood in the visiting room of the county jail, the air sharp with disinfectant and the low hum of fluorescent lights. Julian walked in, wearing the beige uniform that stripped him of everything familiar. He looked thinner, his eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. For a moment, I saw the boy he once was, the child who used to cling to my hand on the first day of school, but then his gaze fell, and the distance between us felt wider than any wall. "Mom," he began, his voice rough. "I didn't want it to come to this. Kiara. She has a problem. Gambling. Online casinos. Sports betting. Anything she could reach. She promised every time it was the last. I thought if I covered the losses, she'd stop. That's why I took the jewelry. The money. I thought I could pay it back before you ever knew." The words struck like stones. And the deed. The lies to the family. He rubbed his hands together, wrists still marked from the cuffs. I told myself it was survival. I told myself I was protecting her. Protecting us. I leaned forward, my voice steady but cold. "Julian, you were not protecting anyone. You were enabling her, destroying me in the process. You stole what cannot be replaced." Tears gathered in his eyes. "I'm sorry. Mom, please, don't press this further." I shook my head. "I can love you, Julian, and still hold you accountable. Love does not erase consequences." He bowed his head, silent. When the guard came to escort him out, I stood and placed my hand on the glass. "Find the man you lost, Julian, but I won't save you this time." As I walked back into the desert sunlight, I knew the next step would not be about punishment. It would be about reclaiming the future I had allowed to slip away for too long. Months slipped by with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. After the hearings, after the papers and signatures, the house grew quiet again. At first, the silence unsettled me, but gradually it became a companion. I filled it with new rhythms, morning walks beneath the cottonwoods, afternoons with a paintbrush in hand at the community center. My landscapes were rough, but each one reminded me of how the desert carries both harshness and beauty in equal measure. I also joined a small book club at the library. Women my age, some widowed, some divorced, all of us carrying stories we rarely told, over tea and paperbacks. I found something I hadn't realized. I missed laughter that wasn't edged with worry. One of them, Dolores, leaned across the table one evening and said, "It's never too late to start again." I believed her. At home, I hired Maria, a woman with calm eyes and a quick wit. Officially, she was a part-time caregiver helping with errands, cooking dinner when my hands ached. But soon she felt more like a friend. We shared recipes, traded stories of our husbands, and sat on the porch watching the sky blaze pink each evening. For once, my days were filled not with anticipation of conflict, but with small joys I could claim as mine. Meanwhile, Eduardo guided me through rewriting my will. The decision came easily. The properties Robert and I had built, the quiet investments I had protected, they would not become fuel for greed. Instead, they would go to a foundation helping women like me, older women cornered by family and left voiceless. As for Julian, I left a modest sum, just enough for him to start over if he chose to rebuild his life. When I signed the final page, Eduardo looked at me over his glasses. "You've secured not just your assets, Isolda, but your dignity." I closed the folder, feeling the weight of years lift. For the first time, my legacy no longer felt like a chain around my neck, but a gift I had chosen to give. And then, one afternoon, a letter arrived from the county jail. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. The county jail's return address stamped in stark black ink. I carried it to the kitchen table and sat for a long while before opening it. Inside was a letter. 5 pages. Written in Julian's careful, slanted script. He began with what I had waited years to hear, an admission of guilt without excuses. He confessed to pawning the jewelry, siphoning money, and keeping silent while Kiara orchestrated her campaign against me. He wrote of her threats. The way she told him she would leave and accuse him of abuse if he didn't comply. He admitted he believed her, and that fear drove him to betray the one person who had always stood by him. I became her shadow. He wrote, not because I loved her, but because I was too weak to stand against her. He described the codependence in stark detail, the late nights spent covering her gambling debts, the lies he told himself about paying everything back, the moments he wanted to confess but swallowed the words instead. He promised that once his probation ended, he would leave New Mexico altogether, take a job in another state, and try to rebuild into someone worth respecting. When I reached the end, his closing line echoed the child I once knew, Mom. I don't ask for forgiveness. I only ask that you remember I was once the boy who loved you. I folded the pages carefully and slid them into the desk drawer beside Robert's watch. I would not answer. Not now, but I could not throw them away either. Somewhere between the lines, the boy I had raised flickered for a moment. Even if the wounds remained too raw to touch, that evening, as I watered the garden, a young man appeared at the gate and called me by name. 6 months passed before I heard the name Marlowe spoken by someone new. It was a bright spring morning, and I was kneeling in the garden, pressing marigold seedlings into the soil, when a voice at the gate called softly, Mrs. Marlowe. I looked up to see a young man, no older than 20, with dark hair that caught the sun and eyes so achingly familiar, they stopped my breath. Robert's eyes. My name is David, he said, shifting nervously. David Marlowe. I'm Julian's son from before Kiara. I don't know if he ever told you. I wiped my hands on my apron and studied him. His posture was steady, his voice respectful, without the defensiveness I had grown used to. He held out a folder. I only found him a few months ago. He mentioned you. I wanted to meet my grandmother. The word landed heavier than any jewel or deed. Grandmother. I gestured him inside, cautious but open, and we sat at the kitchen table where so much had unraveled months before. He told me of his mother, of growing up without Julian, of building his own way through school. He asked nothing of me, no money, no promises, only the chance to know where he came from. I listened, and for the first time in years, family felt like something chosen, not demanded. As he left that afternoon, I stood by the gate and felt a quiet strength settle inside me. The house behind me was still mine, the will secure, the battles behind me. But here was something different, an inheritance I had not expected, the chance to plant new roots in soil that had once been broken. And for the first time, I believed they might grow.